Hello, and thank you for joining us here on our Saturday matinee. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga. And this week we're going to explore a story that truly has deep roots in this community, and over time, the legend, the myth, the story, the history of this famed aircraft has not diminished. It continues to be a topic that is hotly debated. It, a source of a source of discourse for any time that we are out in the public. And to be honest, one of our most popular outreach programs in over all my years with Heritage Mississauga. Each and every year we share stories of the AVRO Arrow, and just it truly never does go away. It's this fantastic model here given to us recently by our student John Eigel. An absolutely incredible story to explore and to share, and again, one that does not diminish with time. So our program today is focusing on, like we said, the story of the AVRO Arrow, and we call it Flying into History, Remembering the Arrow. The AVRO Arrow was an airplane that was well ahead of its time. It was developed in the late 1950s, mid to late 1950s. It flew for a very short period of time. It never passed through the testing phase. Was ultimately the program was canceled by the federal government, and the planes were scrapped. And that's kind of the nutshell version of it. But of course, it's a much more nuanced story. And what we're presenting here today is really going to be an overview of that story. And I encourage you to explore it in all its many chapters. I can recommend countless books. The largest section in our local history library, which is behind me here, our largest section of a singular topic in terms of written material is on the AVRO Arrow. And so we have there is a great deal of material out there. And even if I started recommending a few, I would miss some. So just do a search for AVRO material in your local libraries, online. There's copious amounts of material and imagery. And needless to say, this aircraft, even though it no longer graces our skies, its story has not diminished in time, despite the fact it last flew over 50 years ago, over 60 years ago now. And so this aircraft, again, has not, the story of it continues to fascinate and generate a great deal of conversation. So to give you kind of a brief overview of the AVRO Arrow, its formal name was the CF-105. It was a delta wing jet interceptor. An interceptor tells you what it was designed to do. It was basically an aircraft that was meant to fly very fast, very far, with a minimum payload to shoot down incoming, slower moving bomber aircraft. It was an interceptor aircraft. So it had a specific role in what it was designed to do. As the threat changed in time, well, in a way, this aircraft had the unique position of both being ahead of its time and obsolete at the very same time. And so an interesting story as it evolves, as we'll explore this story. The aircraft itself, the Arrow, was built by AVRO Aircraft Limited, AVRO Aircraft Limited, in Malton, what is here in Mississauga. Design study began in 1953. The government go-ahead on the production for the CF-105 was given in 1955. The first AVRO Arrow rolled out of the assembly line on October 4th of 1957. The first test flight was on March 25th of 1958, and that was there were 5 flying aircraft that were created. We'll talk about each of those aircraft in a moment. The program was terminated by the federal government on February 20th, 1959, in what became known as Black Friday, amidst tremendous controversy. But first, we'll step back in time a little bit and explore the story of the creation of AVRO Canada, and ultimately the story of the AVRO Arrow. In 1945, at the end of the Second World War, the UK-based Hawker Siddeley Group purchased what was known as Victory Aircraft. Victory Aircraft was a government company that operated in Malton, primarily with the production of Lancaster bombers in the Second World War. As a crown corporation at the end of the war, the government was selling off its assets, and AVRO Canada was established in the former Victory Aircraft facility with the principal role to repair and maintain the World War II bomber fleet. But very quickly, it realized that those were no longer needed, and that fleet could be cut back. AVRO Canada truly then invested a great deal in research and development of new prototypes and airframes. AVRO Canada became involved in the project because of the success of developing the earlier CF-100 jet interceptor. And again, the company was located in Malton, what is now the city within the city of Mississauga. Like anything that depends on government funding, a lot of AVRO's programs certainly were tied to the reigning Liberal government. Louis Saint Laurent was the Liberal Prime Minister between 1948 and 1957, and this was the high point of AVRO Canada and its receiving of government contracts. It really rose in prominence during the Cold War, in which Canada positioned itself as the middle power. It was involved in producing aircraft during the Korean War in 1953. But there was a change in political fortunes at the top of our country in 1957, ultimately leading to a change of government. And that was with the election of John Diefenbaker and the Conservative government in 1957. And so you had this transition time of one government, long entrenched, the Liberal government, being replaced by a Conservative government that ran on a platform of more fiscal constraint. During the midst of the end of the Second World War, the emergence of the Cold War, of course, the Korean conflict, and these changing political times, a true industrial giant emerged here in Mississauga. Restructured in the 1950s, AVRO Aircraft Limited and Orenda Engines, its subsidiary company, became enormously intricate companies with a lot of subsidiary entities around it. They were pioneers in computers and electronics. They were an industrial giant, over 50,000 employees spread across 44 subsidiary companies. They generated an estimated $450 million in 1958 and was the third largest corporation in Canada. An absolutely enormous entity tied greatly to government contracts. There's an aerial picture of the AVRO site in Malton. So just to give you a little bit of orientation here, if you can follow my cursor, this is the intersection of Derry Road and Airport Road. This is heading north here and west along Derry, east along Derry. This facility here was part of the fuselage manufacturing facility for AVRO Canada. That's now Hall 1 of the International Center. So just to orient yourself, this whole corner section here is the International Center property. Over in the distance here, you can see what was known most recently as Magellan Aerospace, but that is the old Orenda Engines factory. That's associated with AVRO Canada as well. This is the AVRO Canada Administration Building. And of course, we see here, this is a company floor and the assembly lines and hangars and the like. And so you have quite a great deal of infrastructure here associated with the AVRO company in Malton. Up in the very top left corner here, this is the old Malton town site, the railway village that was surveyed in 1854. And then on the other side of Airport Road here, you have Victory Village, the wartime subdivision that was developed during the Second World War. And again, Derry Road, Airport Road, and AVRO Canada largely situated at the southwest corner of Airport and Derry, with the Orenda Engines factory off on the south side of Derry, a little bit to the east. So that's your orientation of site. You can see just the enormity of the parking lot. These are all automobiles of workers here. And this was a company housing, barracks old Army barracks buildings that were converted. So you had a lot of employees that lived in barracks or dormitory buildings nearby. So an ancestor, we all know what genealogy is, and even airplanes have a little bit of genealogy thrown in. The ancestor of the AVRO Arrow was the CF-100 Canuck, or referred to affectionately or sarcastically as the Clunk. The Canuck, the CF-100, was Canada's first all-weather jet interceptor, and it really marked the beginning of the jet age here in Canada. Production began in 1948 on the CF-100, and it entered RCAF service in 1952. A very reliable aircraft. The 692 CF-100s were produced, and they served between 1956 and 1981, and not just for Canada, but other countries had CF-100s as well. Again, referred to a little sarcastically by pilots as the clunk, due to a reverberation noise that made when landing gear landing gear descended throughout the aircraft, and also known as the lead sled a little bit for the lack of maneuverability on the control stick by the pilot. But again, a key building block, this emergence not only of the technical know-how for AVRO Canada, but also as this link that would ultimately become the all-weather jet interceptor that would be the AVRO Arrow. There's a picture of the CF-100 in flight. And we have a CF-100 in Mississauga. It stands on a pedestal up in Malton, in part of Paul Coffey Park. AVRO Canada didn't stop with the CF-100, of course. They designed it in concept with two being built, a supersonic passenger aircraft known as the C-102 jetliner. The CF-103 Mark III Canuck was the missing link. In a sense, it was just a wind test model that never entered production. But you saw, and this is a picture of the Canuck CF-103 on the left side here, where you see the beginnings of this swept-back delta wing that would emerge with the AVRO Arrow. But these tests that linked the development of the CF-100 into what would ultimately be the CF-105 Arrow are quite apparent when you look at the mock-up for the test model for the CF-103. Always continued to research and design. Every step of production, tooling, alloys had to be designed and created by AVRO Canada. They really were at the cutting edge of the industry at the time. Everything from mock-ups, design plans, research tools, fabrication and assembly lines, computer controls, all groundbreaking ideas, all had to be researched and designed. And this aircraft did represent a true leap forward in technological know-how for the aviation industry. It wasn't the only program. Yes, indeed, there were flying saucers. You can look that up. The VZ-9AV, known as the AVRO car, was designed for the U.S. military in secret in Malton. They weren't officially known or publicized to exist, although people did see them occasionally, and there's some video that survives. Two were built. They're essentially a prototype flying jeep, a hovercraft type of vehicle. They weren't very reliable, and they tended to fail to performance specifications above 3 feet off the ground, and the USA Air Force canceled the program in 1961. There were two that were designed, again, as test models and tested here in Malton. They both still survive and have found their way into museums. But yes, indeed, AVRO Canada, before developing the CF-105 AVRO Arrow, was engaged in a little bit of flying saucer work right here in historic Mississauga. During the early years of the Cold War, there was an emerging perception of a new threat, and that was slower flying Soviet bombers invading North American airspace via the Canadian Arctic. And so a desire was before Canada, placed on the shoulders of Canada, to develop an interceptor jet program to be able to mitigate this potential Soviet threat. And so this is the origins for the CF-100 and ultimately for the CF-105. In April of 1953, and this is after the CF-100 has already entered service, in April of 1953, the Royal Canadian Air Force called for a new supersonic twin-engine two-seat interceptor. The plane, in its specifications, was to have a range of 1,100 kilometers and a top speed of over Mach 1.9. And the contract was awarded to AVRO Canada in December of 1953. Um, this was to be an advance on previous designs. This was to be truly groundbreaking research, design, and development. And prototype testing took place immediately. You had wind test models, you had scale models attached to the top of Beaumark missiles, which were then launched and allowed to free fall into Lake Ontario. And there's an AVRO recovery program underway now to try to find remnants of these models that were jettisoned into Lake Ontario. So they would study the wind effects on the fuselage design of these models as they free fall to the water. And so this was all part of the development of design of this project. Fabrication and production began in the process first with a wooden mock-up, which they could then augment to create the design needs that they required. This is the production line of RL-201 in production, and this comes from a recent series of books on the AVRO Arrow, a scrapbook by Peter Zuring. And some fantastic photographs are located therein. But this is showing RL-201, the first of the flying aircraft in its state of assembly. This was a model of the assembly line, and you can see just the rollout here as planes were put together and pieced together. So quite a fascinating thing to be able to have seen something like this to give you an idea of the scope of the factory floor for AVRO Canada. We already mentioned some of the changes that were going on around this project as it developed. The new prime minister that was elected in June of '57 was John Diefenbaker of the Conservative government. A new chief of air staff was named, and that was Hugh Campbell. And immediately they announced that there would be a review of defense expenditures. And to be honest, they'd run on that platform of fiscal responsibility, and they were making good on their political promise to review defense expenditures. Really, this was a warning shot was sounded over the bow of AVRO Canada. If they had listened to it in September of 1957. When it was announced that in 6 months' time, the AVRO, the CF-105 program would be reviewed as well. And there was also the head of AVRO Canada, Crawford Gordon, and the new chief of air staff, Hugh Campbell, personally did not get along, and that doesn't help things when you're trying to develop programs that are dependent on government funding. But that's an aside. You can read a lot about that dynamic in a number of the books that have been written on the subject. Regardless, the go-ahead continues, or the project continues, and the rollout of the very first AVRO Arrow, RL-201, takes place on October 4th of 1957. And it's not ready to fly yet. It's kind of hurriedly put together, so it's not quite finished. But they wanted a win before the public in terms of unveiling this what many refer to as a space age type of aircraft. It certainly looked different than any fixed wing aircraft that the public had seen before. And as some remarked at the time, stunningly beautiful. Gleaming white delta wing, something out of the space age almost. But again, this proved to kind of capture a little bit of the public imagination of Canadian know-how. The plane wasn't yet ready to fly. That took some time before it came out. Again, the unveiling to public fanfare, but there was still a great deal of work to do. That was October 4th of 1957. Some amazing pictures of that day just shows this gleaming white aircraft with its delta wing formation and people just gathered around it. Lots of pictures being taken. Interestingly, if you go back to the newspapers, the rollout of the Toronto Star didn't quite grab the media attention as the government was hoping it would, and it was relegated to page 5. It actually was in the newspaper after the weather, and a few other things that happened that very same day took greater headlines. They included the launch of the Soviet satellite Sputnik, and believe it or not, Leave It to Beaver premiered in the United States to great fanfare. Both kind of in a way were ominous signs for the AVRO Arrow. Leave It to Beaver was really marked a period of time of inward looking for the for the United States, of return to kind of core family values and retreating from external connections or contacts, if you will, and withdrawing external contracts and the like, and reinvesting in their internal economy. And so it kind of signaled the sense that the United States would begin to look inward for development of its own resources and own technological know-how. And Sputnik launched the space age, and the threat began to evolve from a perception that Soviet bombers posed a threat across the Canadian Arctic to missiles from space. And like we said, the AVRO Arrow managed to be, through no fault of its own, both ahead of its time, or at least a significant advance on technology in its time, and obsolete at the very same time. Of course, it wasn't designed to intercept missiles, but rather its purpose was as an interceptor to intercept bomber aircraft. Again, early rumblings through the Diefenbaker conservative government. The original production cost was estimated for 600 aircraft at a cost of $2 million apiece. Under the Diefenbaker government, the order was slashed from 600 to 100 aircraft, to which AVRO Canada responded with a rising individual unit cost, spiraling out of control with an estimated cost per airplane of $7 to $12 million at the reduced number of aircraft. At the same time, U.S. manufacturers were producing a fighter aircraft, not a jet interceptor, could not fly nearly as fast as what the Arrow was designed to do, but at a significantly cheaper cost, and that was at about $2 million a piece. So you ended up having these push-pull factors in which the Arrow was born into. Regardless, the program does continue. The first flight takes place on March 25th, 1958. RL-201 takes to the sky with Jan Zurkowski at the controls. There's wonderful video online on YouTube for the first flight of the AVRO Arrow. Again, March 25th of 1958. Jan Zurkowski was the lead test pilot for the AVRO Arrow, and he was at the controls for the maiden flights of 3 of the 5 aircraft, those being RL-201, 202, and 203. Jan retired in 1958, and other pilots for the program were Peter Cope, Stan Patochky, and Jack Woodman. Patochky was at the controls for more flying time in the Arrow than any other pilot. There is no living pilot associated with the AVRO Arrow, and Jan himself passed away in 2004. Production continues. Costs were spiraling, but so do also the political rumblings. There you can see a wonderful picture of the AVRO Arrow in flight over Niagara Falls in the bottom left. The Arrow, it's important to remember, was always an experimental aircraft. It was not given the go-ahead to enter in production, at least from entering service. And there was a growing disassociation between AVRO Canada and the federal government, particularly the Air Marshal's staff. Citing rising costs, there was a great deal of concern over the production and frankly, AVRO Canada's handling of the production. To meet the aircraft, in a way, they're kind of the characters in our story. There were 5 flying aircraft, 201, 202, 203, 204, and 205. RL-206 was to be the first aircraft to enter RCAF service. It never had the chance. The program was scrapped before 206 was actually finished. And so here you have the aircraft, and the different colorings and markings were part of the testing of the aircraft. There were winter color markings on some of them. This would have likely had livery painted on it that would have been RCAF colors once it entered service. But again, this was always a prototype aircraft. We have pictures for all the aircraft, and that's part of the fascination of the story as well. There you can see 201 and 202 on the tarmac in Malton. 201 had the most flights. It flew 25 times over 25 hours in the air. 202, 22 flights over 23 hours in the air. There's 203 and 204, although they flew out of Malton, they were also tested out of Trenton, and these are on the winter tarmac at Trenton. RL-203, 12 flights, 13 hours in the air, and RL-204, 6 flights, only about 7 hours in the air, and RL-204 had an accident, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And there's one of the only pictures we have of RL-205, 1 flight, 40 minutes in the air, and 206 never flown, and the rest of them were scrapped long before they neared completion. There's a picture of the assembly. One of the few pictures we have of 206. There's a few images of 206, but you can see in the larger picture there's the tail fin of 206, and in front of it you can see 25000. That is the mock-up model, and used for measurement and calibration and the like. But the assembly line is on the left of that picture. You can see 206, and then beyond it would have been 207, 208, and so on. So you can see these aircraft in production, and there's another picture of 206 in the foreground. The engines themselves, the aircraft, the first flying aircraft flew with a lesser powered engine for which than for what they were designed. They flew with a Pratt & Whitney J75. They were actually designed to fly with a more powerful weapon, which was eventually developed and installed as part of the test flying program. It was the Arenda PS-13, known as the Iroquois. And so there's pictures in the bottom of the Iroquois being tested, both as a side-mounted on a larger bomber aircraft, and as AVRO Arrows in engine test tunnels to the Arenda Engines factory. So you can see the Arenda engines were more powerful than what the aircraft was designed to fly with. There were accidents. Again, this is a prototype aircraft. There's bound to be some issues. We had 201 lost its landing gear and slid on its belly down the tarmac. It might look a little bit more dangerous or a little bit more destructive than 202. However, 201 did fly again, where 202 basically suffered a career-ending accident there with the loss of one landing gear. 204 also had some issues with its landing gear in time, but ultimately was repaired. But there's 202 losing one of its wing landing gear, and it dug the wing into the tarmac when it landed, and it kind of pinwheeled the aircraft around, twisting the airframe somewhat out. And so 202 never flew again. But again, it was always a test in process, if you will. The Arrow itself was formally canceled. There were lots of warnings for it, much of which went unheeded by AVRO Canada. But on February 20th, the government, the Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, rose in the House of Commons at 11 a.m. and made the relatively unexpected announcement that the Arrow and Iroquois engines programs were immediately terminated. What he meant by that was the government funding for the project ceased immediately. As a result, the Arrow project itself was canceled, citing the escalating costs of the program, most of which money ended up being spent either on the scrapping of the program, but the purchase of new military material, including a missile defense system. But it was determined that the Arrow and principally that of the AVRO Canada company, they couldn't maintain the funding commitment to continue the program. So the only the five flying aircraft that were produced did not reach formal service, and the program was again abruptly canceled on February 20th, 1959. The day was known as Black Friday. Ultimately, right off the bat, AVRO Canada did mass layoffs. 13,800 employees at AVRO Canada and Arenda Engines were immediately laid off. That had a spillout effect to all those 44 subsidiary companies. Also had labor shortages affected. One of the few times in our history our population has actually declined was between 1951 and 1961. And you point to a moment like this that kind of shaped the fortunes of people that were very strongly connected to the development of the AVRO Arrow and working at AVRO Canada. Eventually, not immediately, but in quick order, all 37 planes in production were ordered destroyed, including the 5 prototypes. All models, tools, plans, and the production line itself were ordered destroyed. And a lot of people point to this and go, why on earth would this decision have been reached? Well, there's lots of things that go into a decision like that, and a lot of it has to do with a course of action that is usually done to avoid embarrassment to the government itself. But also, these were not aircraft that had entered production. The government owned the plans and the aircraft therein. And if they had no use for them, there was no reason to maintain them. And so, though it was kind of the expedient and cost-effective thing to do was to simply scrap them. Again, the social impacts: 13,800 employees lost their jobs. As estimated that some 50,000 jobs spread all across Ontario and beyond were affected by this cancellation. And approximately 2,000 people in Toronto Township, that's historic Mississauga, lost their jobs. An incredible estimation between 5 and 7% of our working population lost their jobs that day. It's just astronomical when you look at that. Families, communities affected. There's an apartment building in Port Credit where the story is told that every single head of household lost their jobs that day. I mean, the spill out of this is enormous. You had subdivisions that emptied because people were all in that community were all working for AVRO Canada, and people had to relocate to find other jobs, and so communities became people had to leave in a relative hurry. Really and truly, dreams were crushed with the cancellation of the AVRO Arrow program. The comics started some conspiracy theories almost immediately. Diefenbaker shot down the Arrow and the like. I mean, there is a real story here that the Arrow itself was both an advance in technology and obsolete at the very same time. This declaration here, a memorandum that's dated on April 2nd of 1959 from the Air Marshal's office, was presented to the Prime Minister's office at the time, and ultimately laying the decision on the Prime Minister's shoulders as to what to do about it. But they determined 2 courses of action, and sometimes you shake your head at their decision, but we don't know how they reached this. So it seems rather quick in observation to analyze a document like this. But they're basically saying that they are offering 2 courses for the government to follow in regards to the AVRO Arrow. The first course, declaring as surplus material to Crown Assets Disposal Agency. This course is not recommended for the reason that this agency has a prerogative of selling the material in its original state. This could lead to subsequent embarrassment. That is, airframe and engine could conceivably be placed on public view or even in fact be used as a roadside stand. This, I am sure you will agree, is most undesirable. Option number 2, relinquishing any D&D interest in the airframes and engines to DDP for ultimate disposal by that agency. In this case, DDP can reduce it to scrap. This course is recommended. And so really, there's very little consideration given to, trying to find an alternative for keeping this aircraft. There seemed to be no will to do that. And frankly, not really any interest in buyers abroad. The aircraft wasn't seen as necessary. As advanced as it was, the United States weren't purchasing it. Britain wasn't interested, at least not overly interested at the time. It is important to remember in this context that AVRO Canada was a subsidiary of Hawker Siddeley in England, and so a lot of the plans and concepts and stuff actually belong to the parent company. But nonetheless, the decision is made by the federal government to reduce the airplane to scrap, and the order is given out for tender, and very quickly it closes, with the Lax Brothers, a scrap company in Hamilton, receiving the contract. And this is a picture of what is known as Death Row on March 18th, 1959. And you can see the 4 flying arrows are in the process of being reduced to scrap. Now the question, of course, is there were 5. And very quickly, there emerged this myth that shortly after cancellation, that in the early morning hours, a neighbor was wakened by a screaming jet engine and swore that one arrow flew away. Well, yeah, it's a good myth, and I don't want to dispel it. I'd love them to find one of the legends is it's hidden in a barn in Saskatchewan somewhere or something along those lines. It'd be wonderful if one survived. One has never come to light, and the pictures begin to tell a different story in terms of the destruction of the aircraft. Again, like I said, the conspiracy stories never ended. This one either blames aliens or Americans and for the destruction of the aircraft. But again, the stories and the myths and the legends and the conspiracies, they continue to this day. So some of the aircraft, again, the death row one, if you look closely at these, you'll see from the bottom 205, then 201, then 203, and at the top 204. The question always revolved around 202. 202 was the aircraft that had the collapsed wing landing gear in an early picture, and it again never flew again after that accident. So the question always was, where is 202? Because from these pictures, you can quite plainly see that 205, 201, 203, and 204 were not in a state to fly, and likely again never flew again. And they're in the process of being scrapped in these pictures. But then you have these other photographs that survive, and they don't show 4 aircraft; they show 5. And so from the left, you can kind of see them from nose to tail as it goes along in order. And the one on the far right, you can see all its machine covers have already been removed, and its nose cone has been removed. And so there we have this line of arrows lined up. And so the question again, where's 202? Well, pictures like this begin to answer that story. And there you can see 202 in the foreground. That in the previous picture was the one at the top of the picture. Nose cone missing, all the machine covers, all the machine panels are taken off. 202 is already in a state of disassembly. Again, this was the aircraft that had the previous accident with its landing gear. And so by the time that the famous death row picture is taken, it is presumed that 202 has already been scrapped, that it was the first of the aircraft to die, or the first of the aircraft to be dismantled. What happened to the ones inside the assembly bay? Well, they were destroyed where they were. They were dismantled on site, cut down, and in some cases, the rumor is told that they were crushed by bulldozers. At the time of cancellation, 206 was 95% complete. It was ready to roll off the assembly line and never had the chance. Portions of all the aircraft, all the 5 flying aircraft do survive, including the nose cone of 206. We can say rather conclusively that the prototypes, the pieces that survive, represent aircraft that never flew again, including, again, it wasn't 206 because its entire nose cone survives. And so, these are parts of those stories. Did one get away? If so, which one, and what happened to it, and how do we have parts for all of them? And certainly it wasn't 202, so it must have been one of the other ones. And that's part of the myths and legend. That's part of the fascination that keeps the legend alive. And like I said, the evidence begins to give a little bit more conclusive answer that one did not survive. But I don't want to burst anybody's balloon. I'd love to find that story is incorrect. But nonetheless, you can read a lot about the myths and conspiracies. But let's focus on the truly remarkable story here, and this was the Canadian development of an advanced aircraft at its time, despite its cancellation and ultimate destruction. It is something to be proud of for Canadian achievement. The Arrow does live on. There is a full-size replica of the AVRO Arrow, a non-flying replica that was produced by the Canadian Air and Space Museum. It is no longer at that facility, but it will be unveiled in the near future at the Eganville Airport, and it's the only full-size replica of the AVRO Arrow. Is it the end of the story? Like all good legends in a way, a legend never truly dies. There are plenty of books and publications and stories and documentaries and all the AVRO Arrow continues to thrive as an interest subject. And recently we produced a comic book on the AVRO Arrow called The Legend of the Arrow. And so these are things that you can still pick up, read, watch, explore. learn about, explore a true Canadian whodunit, a good mystery to solve on a true story of an incredible moment of Canadian achievement, ultimately something that was canceled and destroyed. So thank you for joining us here on the Saturday Matinee and for exploring a little bit of the local flavor of our connections to the CF 105 AVRO Arrow, a true legend here in the city of Mississauga. And again, I encourage you to explore the arrow, see what you can find about it. And here is a model once again of the AVRO Arrow. I do invite you to explore it. Visit your library, do some reading, look online, watch some of the documentaries. There's lots to wade through in the story of the AVRO Arrow, and something that I encourage you to do so. And remember, it's a Mississauga story. Thank you.